So good morning. This is lecture 4 of the Religions of Israel by Rabbi Lawrence Troster. And today we're going to finally get to worship and ritual. And hopefully at the end we'll begin the transition to the biblical religions. Now I want to say one thing at the beginning, one final thing about divine fluidity. It never really goes away. Okay, it changes, but it never goes away. In fact, we still have it today. And for two reasons. Take, for example, the priestly theology of God's presence, the kavod, which is only supposed to dwell in the temple. What is the kind of paradigm of the priestly sanctuary? It's the tabernacle, and the tabernacle is portable. So there's an underlying tension in the priestly tradition, which is so very much located that the divine presence sits in one sacred space in the earth, that, you know, the tabernacle, wherever the tabernacle goes, becomes the Holy of Holies. So there's an inherent tension already in the priestly theology. But secondly, even after, in the late First Temple period, when they shut down all the local shrines, and there's a big argument about when what we call the synagogue begins to emerge. Nonetheless, the emergence of two ideas, first of all, that you can pray to replace sacrifice, and you can do it from anywhere, which is maybe pre-exilic roots, but definitely during the Babylonian exile. And secondly, the emergence of the synagogue in the Second Temple period, even when the temple is rebuilt, shows you that divine fluidity still exists to this very day. Because, remember Paul came up, how can God be in one place if God is everywhere? Yeah, but that's the point. God is everywhere, but can manifest himself in different places at the same time. And when you think about it, that's exactly what's going on in the synagogue. In other words, unless you have a very abstract idea of God. Just a minute, Robert. If you believe that somehow you can feel the closeness of God's presence in a synagogue, and if a synagogue becomes to a certain extent a holy place, a sacred space, which it sort of does in many places, then in effect that's divine fluidity. God can manifest himself anywhere more than once at different places at the same time. So it's never completely gone away. It's never completely gone. The people who are, the Deuteronomic people are the ones who are least kind of pushing, away against divine fluidity because they don't believe God's presence ever comes down on the earth, only God's name, so they have a much more abstract idea, but that idea fails ultimately. So that's why it never really goes away. Yes, Robert, you had a question or a comment.
How does that fit in with the fact that there's this almost obsession amongst the Jews about the temple? The first temple, the second temple, that isn't divine fluidity. It is.
We want the sacred space back. Yes, yes. It's a tension that goes between the idea that we want to have a central sacred space that we see as the house of God. On the other hand, we also developed means, again, this may predate, it goes back to the old theology of all the multiple shrines, but certainly from the time of the exile, one can certainly say, yes, we want the temple back, but, we can live without the temple too, right? And there was one historian, J.Z. Smith, who years ago in a book, he wondered what would have happened to the temple if it hadn't been destroyed. Would sacrifice eventually have stopped? Would it have become irrelevant spiritually to most Jews? Would it have turned into some kind of giant synagogue? So the rabbis, while always saying they wanted the temple to come back, basically in their own day reformed Judaism further so that you could live as a Jew and you didn't need it at all.
The impression I always got was we, the diasporan Jews, always accepted it as second best. We couldn't have the temple, so we settled for.
But, yes, on some level you're right, but on the other hand, the way in which Jewish spirituality changes to live without sacrifices and without the temple, especially the sin offering, is so remarkable that, Judaism as you see, has survived 2,000 years and flourished without a temple. And if the temple never gets rebuilt, and I don't expect it will, we'll be perfectly fine as seeing it as something, as an ideal rather than a reality. After all, Jerusalem, the earthly Jerusalem, is replaced with this notion of the heavenly Jerusalem, right? Yeah.
Could you also say, I don't know if it's sacrilegious to say this or not, but if the temple had not been destroyed,
Yeah.
and therefore the need to replace sacrifice with prayer, etc., Judaism might have died out 2,000 years ago.
I agree.
Who knows? Who knows? But as you will see, prayer actually was abundant before the destruction of the temple. In other words, and Jews had synagogues. So if the temple had never been destroyed, Jews would have continued to have synagogues, right? The synagogue would just function a little differently than it does now. As it did, it functioned a little differently while the temple still stood.
So what were the synagogues then?
In the diaspora, they were called prayer houses, where Jews got together to pray, and also were probably communal centers, kind of like a JCC. And in the land of Israel itself, synagogues originally were basically the local town hall, where any public gatherings took place, which would include some things that we would consider religious, but also not necessarily so. Right?
This was during the Second Temple.
Yes, during the Second. I mean, the word synagogue, synagogas, in Greek is a translation of Beit Knesset, and Beit Knesset means house of assembly. It doesn't mean a house of prayer. In the diaspora, they used to call them prayer houses, prosuche, right, in Greek. So there was a difference. What we call the synagogue today started off as multiple institutions that eventually melded into one when the temple's destroyed.
Also for teaching, no? Like the shul.
Well, yeah, the idea of a place of studying Torah, which is probably what it was used for both in the diaspora and in the land of Israel. People would get together for communal study and things of that sort.
What is the translation of shul?
School probably, no?
Well, shul is Yiddish for school, right? So, yes, but even in the rabbinic times, there was a distinction between the Beit Midrash, the house of study, and the Beit Knesset, okay? Again, they all eventually, more or less coalesce. But again, this is where divine fluidity continues to exist.
Did they have any sacrifices in those synagogues?
No, they didn't. You see, that was one of the big distinctions. Now, we know that there were, in fact, a couple of other temples, minor temples, that existed even while the temple in Jerusalem existed, but they were not significant, right? But the fact is, synagogues...
The one in Egypt?
Yeah, the one in Egypt, you can call the Samaritan synagogue. There's some hints that there may have been one somewhere else in Transjordan. But the fact is that, it pretty much became a dogma that you don't sacrifice anywhere except in the temple. Okay, so let us now move on to the issue of what did your average Israelite do to practice their, for lack of a better term, religion? Okay, and we're talking before the change to the biblical revolutions. And so we're talking about two aspects, the public and the private. And when you look at scholarly literature, there's been up until fairly recently, it's been completely about public worship. And the assumption was there really wasn't much going on in the home. That has radically changed, partly because of feminist biblical archaeology and scholarship, by the way. That we now know that there was actively a religious ritual going on in the home in addition to the public space. So we're going to start with the public space. So I want to begin with this again, this picture of the Israelite cosmology, because I think it's important to note that ancient buildings reflected the cosmology of the people who built them. And that is exactly the same with Israelite temples, okay? That the temple reflects the cosmology. The vertical cosmology is reflected in a horizontal structure of architecture. And here's the diagram by Nachum Sarna of the tabernacle. And the tabernacle has three gradations of sacred space. the outer area where the Israelites could come, and that was where the altar was of sacrifice. The tabernacle itself is divided into two areas. The first area is the outer area called the holy place, where the priests could go, and then the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could. So you see, horizontally, you see a tripartite sacred space. It is, in effect, a reflection of the vertical tripartite structure of the cosmos, where you've got God up here, the heavens, and earth. Okay? So that's the thing you have to understand, that the temples reflected this cosmology, and that's really important. And here's a diagram, all such diagrams are obviously tentative, of Solomon's temple, right? And you see again the gradations. Here's the public area, the porch, which is called the Ulam, with two pillars, Yachin and Boaz. You have the holy place, which is called the Heichal, and the inner Holy of Holies, which is called the Devir. So again, an exact replication of that. And the second temple, by the way, has the same basic structure, but also you see it in, even if you look in, we'll get to it, the temple at Arad that they found also has a tripartite structure. By the way, this tripartite structure is actually Canaanite. It's a reflection of Canaanite sacred buildings, and it's very similar to Egyptian ones, by the way. If you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and you see the Temple of Dendor they have there, it's essentially a tripartite horizontal space. It's not that different because the Northwest Semites and the Egyptians had a very similar cosmology. Very different from the Mesopotamians, by the way, or not very different, but different from the Mesopotamians, who developed the idea of the seven heavens, because of their astronomy. But the point is that sacred space follows it. Okay, so what was the sacred space like? Well, we know from Exodus 25, we have the description of the tabernacle, which again becomes a template for, whether it's a projecting back into the past or not, it becomes the template for Israelite public worship. But we also have, of course, other forms of public worship space, and those are what's called a bama, a high place, or bamot in the plural, and that's where we get our bima from. Okay, and we know that these sacred spaces were served by priests. Right? Now, what evidence do we actually have for this? Well, a couple of interesting archaeological discoveries, somewhat in dispute. This is an ivory pomegranate, which was not found by archaeological dig, was found on the archaeological market. And on it says, belonging to the temple, literally house of, Yud-He Vav-He, holy to the priests. And it's from the 10th century BCE. Now, there was a lot of dispute over whether this was a fake or not. And there's still a dispute about it, but the opinion is now shifted to the fact that it is authentic. Back to that it is authentic.
Were they carbon dated it?
It's not a question of carbon dating. It's a question also of the letters, and it's a huge complex area. But the fact is that after reading through it, I'm convinced that this is genuine. Okay.
Is the writing on the bottom?
On
the shoulder.
Yeah, on the shoulder.
That old, and the writing could have been faked later.
Well, yeah, but that's also been in other words, this could have been an Egyptian artifact that somebody then put an inscription on. But from what I have read, that's probably not the case, okay?
When I was in Israel, that was said to be one of the very few documented...
Yes, and then there was a whole thing, there was a forgery and the Israel Museum took it out. I think they're back to displaying it, but the point is, this is very likely one of our proof texts, not necessarily for the temple in Jerusalem, but probably for the temple in Jerusalem, okay? It could refer to one of the other temples, right?
Where was it found?
It was found on the market. It wasn't found in an archaeological site. That's part of the problem, that a lot of these things get illegally excavated, and there's a big argument among archaeologists whether any artifact that is not found in the site should ever be displayed or talked about in scholarly papers. There's a huge argument amongst archaeologists about
We
this.
just found something a couple of days ago was in the paper, like something that used to be build the temple.
Oh, that I hadn't heard about. You'll have to let me know.
I
One of the other
That means the Dead Sea Scrolls would be ignored because
Well, yeah, exactly. Here's another one that was also controversial, an inscription supposedly about King Jehoash, about repairs to the temple in Jerusalem from the late 19th century BCE, which is referred to very specifically in 2 Kings 12. Okay, King Jehoash is one of the Judean kings, and there's a whole story about him repairing the temple. Well, somebody found this, which supposedly is an inscription by Jehoash about the repairs to the temple. The problem again is that some people consider this to be a fake. Here's the actual inscription. Okay. Here's the Hebrew and here's the English. Now it's written not in the modern Hebrew alphabet, it's written in the the earlier Israelite alphabet, but it basically follows pretty much what's in the Book of Kings. That's one of the things that people feel may reason why it's a forgery. But the point is,
too convenient.
Yeah, too convenient, and people talk about the stone and the patina and all kinds of things. Again, from what I've read, is that the opinion is shifting back that this. Part of the problem is these artifacts were given through a particular antiquities dealer who was accused of forgery, brought to a trial in Israel, and he was acquitted. And the judge said that there is no proof that he actually forged these things. That included, by the way, the box that held the bones supposedly of Jesus' brother. Okay, so there's this, but the point is the opinion is now shifting back, in my opinion, to believing that these inscriptions are real. So,
See the same guy that was selling those Rothkos?
no.
is he the same guy who who first got the Dead Sea Scrolls?
No. This is in the last 20 years. So the point is that assuming this is authentic, assuming the pomegranate is authentic, here is actual archaeological proof of the existence of Solomon's temple.
That was actually my professor
Okay.
at HUC, Harry Orlinsky, who went as effectively like an agent. You know this story, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's a whole...
As Mr. Green, and he got them, basically purchased them for the...
That was some of them. There was another one where there was actually an ad in the New York Times for them. If you remember when we studied the Dead Sea Scrolls, I found a copy of the ad. Anyway, here is the outline of the Temple of Herod, again, which has that same tripartite structure. Here is the outer area with the sacrificial altar. You have pillars, right? Also, you have an inner area. And then you have the Holy of Holies, which has two incense altars in front of it, which would match the incense altar that's in front of the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle.
Arad is a place?
Yes, it's in the Negev. All right? Yeah?
No, that's where I had my spiritual epiphany. My daughter lived in Iraq.
Really? And you saw the temple?
No, not the temple. The kids were going in the car. They
Yeah.
had World Union of Jewish Students.
Yeah.
Is housed there. And I went out onto the cliffs there, and it was grander than the Grand Canyon ever was. I mean, it absolutely.
Yeah, I was in Arad. Was I in Arad? I'm not even sure I was in Arad. It may have been somewhere else. But certainly I would love to go back there, because here's the temple. These are the incense. This is the Holy of Holies at Arad. Here are the incense altars. And here are those stelae that I told you about that represent, which are existed in the Holy of Holies, right? Now, I read something recently that there may have been a kind of transition where that they stopped sacrificing at the local shrines and temples, and at least animal sacrifices, and in the latter years only did incense offerings and meal offerings, but then they knocked the whole thing down. In other words, it may not have all been sort of wiped out at once. It may have been sort of a transition. During the time of Hezekiah, they may have said no more animal sacrifices except in Jerusalem, and then under the Josiah later on, knocked them down completely. But the point is, there were other such temples.
When was Hezekiah?
Hezekiah is the late 8th century BCE. Josiah is just, in the late 7th century BCE. He's one of the last kings of Judea.
And Arad is when? time this was?
Arad, the temple at Arad dates back pretty early, at least, before Hezekiah. There was an earlier structure underneath. It's a very, very early, 8th century BCE, the present structure. So that's pretty early.
Does Tel Dan have the same thing? Or?
Well, Tel Dan doesn't have a temple. Tel Dan has a bama, as you will see. The point is that we know there were temples at Bethel. At Shiloh was probably was before the temple in Jerusalem. The most important shrine in Israel was the temple at Shiloh. Unfortunately, the ruins of the temple of Shiloh were completely obliterated when a Byzantine church was built on top of the ruins, but the compound around it has been excavated, and it was an important sacred compound. The Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim, which is later, but there's several other places where there definitely were not just open-air shrines, but temples that we know about from archaeology and the Bible as well. Okay? So in addition to temples, you have this bama. And what is a bama? Here's an example of a Canaanite bama from Megiddo from the 2200 BCE, very, very early. You see, it's kind of a platform in a circle, and the sacrifices would be done on top, and around was a sacred precinct. Okay? But it was open air. So here is the Tel Dan bama. And exactly the same shape. It's a very, Here's the Tel Dan bama. Here's the platform. There's the platform. It's from the 9th century BCE. It's very early. It's definitely Israelite. It's not Canaanite.
That must have been restored.
Yeah, that's restored.
Yeah, this part is restored.
Wait, is that the altar?
Yeah, I'll get to that. So the point is that we know that there were, both from the text of the Bible and from archaeology, there were Israelite bamot, high places. In fact, that was one of the things that got specifically attacked by the Deuteronomic people, was to get rid of those places. But you find these also in a number of different places, Israelite sites. Again, based on a Canaanite model, or Northwest Semitic, however you want to put it. So we know these places all occurred. That was where Israelites did, and they were all over the country. So you didn't go to a centralized site, you would go to a local shrine. So when we talk about the pilgrimage festivals of Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuot, and it says you've got to go on a pilgrimage to a local shrine, it didn't mean going all the way to Jerusalem originally. It meant going to your local shrine, right? Now, what went on there? Of course, the central activity that went on was animal sacrifice. There was, however, also other kinds of sacrifices, meal offerings and incense, but animal sacrifice was the primary mode of worship, and it was done on altars. So here is an Israelite altar from Megiddo from the 9th century BCE, and you'll notice the horns. In the Bible, the altar is mentioned as having horns. Why they have horns, that's a matter of discussion. But the fact is, this is not an animal. There are two kinds of altars. This is an incense altar. It's too small for animal sacrifices. And in fact, again, when you look in Exodus, the description of the tabernacle, you see, again, there's an incense altar, and there is the altar for the animal sacrifice. So
the horn is even, it's in the Psalms.
Yes, exactly, and you know,
In the Hallel.
absolutely, it's mentioned. The horns are mentioned numerous times in the Bible that the altar had horns. Again, this is based on earlier Canaanite models. Okay, yeah.
Sacrifices were given on the bima and the
on the bama, and yes,
So
it depends on where it is, right? In other words, some places, it was on the bama, and you know. So here is one that they found in Beersheba. It's in the museum. They found the stones of it, which means it was broken up again by the revolution that occurred later, and they reconstructed it and put it in the Israel Museum. And it's quite large. So this is an animal sacrifice altar. Again.
How does this relate time-wise to the first or second temple.
This is all First Temple, 8th century BCE. Remember,
This was not in the so-called First Temple. This was like a separate synagogue?
no, separate temples all around the country, separate shrines. Again, you have Solomon's temple, which probably began not as a national temple, but as a royal chapel. And at the time of the building of Solomon's temple, you have all these shrines, the Bamot, and other temples around the countryside. Right? It's only later everything gets centralized to Jerusalem. But this is the style of worship. Incense altars, animal altars with horns.
By saying chapel, you mean what? Like a gathering area? Like
No, a private temple of the king.
Oh, private.
You know, like the Queen of England has her own chapel at Windsor. You know, it's not a public church. It's the place where the royal family goes to worship.
There must be some speculation as to why that is.
Yes, there's a whole bunch of them. Again, it may have to do with the notion of strength. The word, it may go back to a pagan idea of seeing Baal is represented by a bull. We know that there are some bull figures from the north that some Israelites use the bull as sort of a metaphor for Yud-He Vav-He. So it may go back to something like that.
But it's not functional.
No, it's not functional. Well, actually, there is a certain function on that in the stories where people, the Arei Miklat, the cities of refuge, or there's the story how David's former chief of staff during the early time of Solomon wants to kill him, and he runs into a shrine and grabs onto the horns to sort of have sanctuary, and he's dragged out anyway. Okay, so if you were someone who were kind of what we would call a manslaughter case, you could run to a shrine and hold on to the horns, and the avenger couldn't touch you there, right, while you were holding on to the horns of the altar. Okay? All right, so...
Did you already explain how this structures related to the cosmology?
Yeah, the idea is that the horizontal structure, the three parts of the horizontal structure correspond to the tripartite cosmology vertically. Okay, that's definitely the case.
What do you mean? The heaven, the...
Well, God, heavens, earth. You have the outer area for the Israelites. Yeah, the outer area for the Israelites, the inner area for the priest, the Holy of Holies for the high priest. That's replicated in the temple in Arad.
But God, heavens, earth.
Yeah.
Is the cosmology.
Yeah, pretty much. Or some people think heaven, earth, Sheol, but, it's probably, that's a different... they're not all... It's not like a dogma, you know what I mean? Okay, so who gets to do the sacrifice? Well... the priests, right? Well, not always. Okay? In other words, we know that in the earlier period, sacrifice was not restricted to a specific priesthood. We have evidence that royalty could do sacrifices. We have David doing them, Solomon doing them. So royalty could do sacrifices, all right? We know that originally the firstborn son was consecrated as a priest. Best example, Samuel. Samuel doesn't come from the Levites, and he is consecrated as a priest. And Samuel functions as a priest. He does sacrifices, right? And if you can see that in the description of him. If you want to turn, for example, just to show you kind of how this operates, if you go to 1 Samuel chapter 9, this is a good chapter to look at for a variety of reasons. This is the beginning of the story of Saul, okay? And Samuel has already been told by the people,
Can you give us a page?
Page 587, Samuel's already been told by the people, we want to have a king now, and God says they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. So anyway, then the story shifts to the beginning of the beginning of the story of Saul. We get introduced to Saul. He loses these donkeys, and he's told, let's go to this town where it says there is a man of God in this town. That's a term for a prophet. And the man is highly esteemed. We'll go there. Maybe he'll help us find the animals.
What verse?
That's down in verse 6. And so then they go there. And if you take a look down at the bottom on verse 11, they go to the town. They meet some girls coming out who are going to the well. And they say, is the seer, an old term for a prophet? Yes, he's up there ahead of you. You'll find him before he goes up to the shrine, right? The Bama. He's going to the Bama to eat, doing the sacrifice. So here is Samuel. And this is a great example of this kind of early idea of sacrifice. It's done on an outside Bama, and they do the sacrifices outside, and part of the sacrifice is eaten by the celebrants, right? Because the sacrifice is seen as a kind of sacred communion meal with God, right? So here's Samuel, who is not of priestly descent. He's a firstborn son. His mother has dedicated him before he was born to the service. He functions as the priest eventually. He first as the assistant, but then as the priest at Shiloh, at the temple at Shiloh. All right? Now, what happens later on is the tribe of Levi are seen as priests, and they are the ones who are the priests through a lot of the territories, the shrines, and so on and so forth. But later on, you get the Aaronites, the descendants of Aaron, claiming exclusively to be the priests. And under the later reforms, the Levites are reduced to non-sacrificial functionaries, and only the descendants of Aaron become the priests. Now, they fight this. This is not something that, this is something that is a very big tension. And the Aaronites only finally went out in the Second Temple period, but the Levites are never happy with this. I mean, and that's what happens essentially.
When is this transition?
In the late First Temple period, when they centralize worship, all the Levites are basically deprived of their livelihood as priests.
So you're saying that pre-Levitical,
Yeah.
Samuel actually pre-Levite? I mean,
Yeah. Well, you could.
Samuel was a Levite or not?
No, he wasn't. That's the point. In other words, the Levites might have been functioning as priests, but the firstborn son could also be a priest.
There was multiple.
Yeah, exactly. It was a lot looser than that.
Any Levite.
Yeah, the Levites were, but again, the king could could lead sacrifices, right?
Right.
So it was a much looser definition as to who was allowed to do the sacrifices. Yes, Paul.
So the Kohanim were the big boys.
Well, the Kohanim originally could be a firstborn son or a Levite. Later on, the Kohanim were restricted to the descendants of Aaron. Okay?
By the descendants of Aaron.
Yes, but that was part of the Deuteronomic Revolution. Okay?
So was that late?
Yeah, it was that late.
Deuteronomic Revolution was against that or for that?
They were for the Aaronites. Okay? In other words,
I thought Deuteronomy 9 very clearly says God wanted to kill Aaron for what he did.
yeah, but that doesn't mean anything. When you look at what happens, the Aaronites win out. Okay? And part of that is if you look at what happens, if you look at the story, and we will look at another time, of the Deuteronomic Revolution under Josiah, he brings all the local priests in from the Levites from all the other shrines and basically forbids them to function in the temple in Jerusalem. He gives them other things to do. Okay, and that's how it emerges that in the Second Temple period, the Levites become the functionaries in the temple to do everything but the sacrifices. Now
It only starts with Josiah, or it starts actually even later?
I would say Josiah is definitely, I would say Josiah primarily. And what's interesting is that one of the main functions of the Levites in the Second Temple, they're the people who do the music, the singing and the instruments. And as Ben Summers said to me, this reflects the tension between the singers and the functionaries that lives to this day, and the tension between rabbis and cantors. which I thought was pretty funny. But the point is, this gets us into another important point, which is, let's look at one other text. Look at Judges chapter.
They didn't have that tension, by the way.
Is that called the Deuteronomic Revolution because it happened in the Deuteronomic time?
Because of the people who wrote the book of Deuteronomy were responsible for it. We'll get to that. If you take a look, this is again going back to this story we've looked at once before in chapter 17 of the book of Judges on 556. It's the story about this guy whose name was Micah. He was an Ephraimite, and he supposedly stole some money from his mother, but he gave it back, and she didn't blame him, and so she gives it to him, and they make an image, probably of God. They make an actual image of God. This is 556 at the bottom. And so they build a little shrine in their home. Okay? Now, it says in verse 5, now the man Micah had a house of God. He made a little temple in his house, essentially. And he had an ephod, and he had teraphim, which are little fetishes, and he inducted one of his sons to be his priest. See that? And then, and this is an editorial comment by the Deuteronomic editors of the book of Judges. In these days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did as he pleased. Okay, the later editors are saying this Mishagas was because everybody could do whatever they wanted. Because in the eyes of the later Deuteronomic people, this is it. This is completely horrible that he makes an image of God and he makes one of his sons, but it's completely wrong. It's an abomination to them. So then what happens is, it says here, there's a young man from Bethlehem of Judah, from the clan seat of Judah. He was a Levite. All right? So there's this Levite from Judah, and he leaves Bethlehem, and he's looking for a job. Essentially, that's what it is. And he ends up in the house of Micah, and Micah says, he tells him who he is, and Micah says, stay with me, and be a father and a priest to me, and I'll pay you 10 shekels a year, in addition to clothing, room and board, so to speak. And the Levite says, fine, So here's an example of both aspects of this early period, where you have a guy's son acts as a Kohen, but a Levite comes along, well, he's better, so he's a probably more, suitable person, because he's a Levite. So the Levite comes, and he's now officiating at the shrine, right? So in the first temple period, the Levites become the main group of priests, right? I think that probably is an evolution from this looser thing to the Levites. Now, what happened? Yeah, the first temple period. Now, what ultimately happens, and now one other important thing with this is, there used to be the idea that in the first temple period, there was no prayer in the temples and shrines. Why did people say this? Because there's no mention of anything spoken in the book of Leviticus during the sacrificial service. We now know this is completely wrong. I always thought it was absurd, the idea that they didn't say anything. And we know now that this is completely wrong. For one thing, we have this. This is a silver amulet found in a grave in Jerusalem that comes from the 6th century BCE that has the famous Kohanic blessing from the book of Numbers in it. This is our oldest biblical text outside of biblical manuscripts. So the priestly blessing in Numbers, chapter 6, verses 24 to 26, may the Lord bless you and keep you, right? Is very old. It's a piece of liturgy.
So can you prove it was done during the sacrifices?
Well, this is step one, okay? So first of all, we know that priestly blessing is extremely old, and we know that in the Second Temple period it was done at the end of the sacrificial service, so why not? I mean, it says in Numbers, this is what the priests were supposed to do for the people. They were supposed to bless the people. This is, it's considered such a holy text, somebody made it into an amulet and buried it as a piece of grave goods with somebody to protect them after death. Okay? We also know that there was music even in the shrines and temples of the first period. Here's one example of it. These are Israelite lyre players. Okay? It's actually not from the time of Solomon's temple. It's from Sennacherib. In other words, these are, well, actually they were in the Solomon's temple. Sennacherib was the Assyrian who came and attacked Judea, did not destroy Judea, but forced Judea into becoming a vassal state to the Assyrians. And in the process, he carried off a bunch of people. He destroyed the town of Lachish. I think we showed you some of that. There's or actually it was an earlier guy, but there are panels that were put up in Nineveh showing the destruction of Lachish. Anyway, these are Judeans, and they're carrying harps. Or lyres, really. They're lyres, okay? And so we know that there were singers in the Solomon's temple. Here's another example of it. This is a seal from the 7th century BCE with an engraving of a lyre. In Hebrew, a kinnor. Okay, it's called a kinnor. And the ancient Hebrews say belonged to Ma'adana, the king's daughter. We don't know who she was or which daughter she was, but notice she puts a kinnor on it. Now, by the way, we also know that women were among one of the things that women did was involved in music in ancient Israel. Most importantly, drummers. Any reference to drummers in the Bible are always women. This is the tof. It's often translated as tambourine, but that's not right. It's a hand drum. And this is a figure of a hand drummer. Okay?
So you're saying Miriam didn't shake a timbrel?
She had a hand drum. She had a hand drum. This is actually not an Israelite figure. This is a Phoenician one, but it's found in a town that was on the border between, and we know that women in ancient Israel were drummers. Okay?
Like a tambourine, isn't it?
It's not a tambourine. There's no. It's just. It doesn't have the little rattly parts. It's just a drum. If you've seen Native American hand drums, that's more like what it is. The tuff. Okay.
It's actually. I don't know how they originally thought it was a timbrel, like a tambourine.
Yeah.
That probably reflects our modern bias.
Absolutely.
Women and men.
Absolutely.
Men are drummers. Women have tambourines.
Right. Exactly. No, but any reference to drummers in the Bible, they're always women, by the way. And so there is a possibility that some female musicians were participating in the music in the shrines. We do know that they were probably a professional guild, and we know that whenever there was a battle and the men came back, the women went out and did all the singing of the victory songs. That was very typical. Okay, we have plenty of biblical texts about that.
All the references to instruments in like Book of Psalms doesn't say who is playing it.
Yes.
It's more like the B'nai Korach.
Well, I'm getting to that right now. I'm not saying that women were all the musicians. What we know, they were the drummers. Okay? We know that from the Book of Psalms, there were instruments that were part of sacred prayer. And here's some of the latest stuff that I've heard. Again, some scholars originally felt there was no music, no prayers in the temples at all. That seemed patently absurd from anything we knew about any ancient temples at all, and that they said music was only introduced in the Second Temple period. That is completely wrong. What we now believe is that many of the early psalms are liturgies from all the temples and shrines. And I'm going to just say very briefly how this happened. The Book of Psalms is an anthology of anthologies. If you look at it, there are sub-collections within the book itself. Okay? And the Book of Psalms is divided into 5 books, corresponding to the 5 books of the Torah. That's why it's divided into 5 books. We know that it was completed in its present form by the 2nd century BCE. But that was part of a long process. And here's probably what happened. This is what scholars now believe. that if you go to the Psalms, there's a bunch of the Psalms are attributed to what we will call composers and guilds. The sons of Korach is one of them, right? There are collections within the Psalms attributed to certain clans. Now we know that in the Second Temple times, from the Book of Chronicles, these musician clans were Levites. They're mentioned. By the Second Temple time, they were clans of Levites who were temple singers. However, we have evidence that in the First Temple times, these were associated with local shrines. And that
In the first time.
in the First Temple, and that when the shrines got shut down, all these musician clans sort of had to come into Jerusalem. They were Levites. This was part, again, this transition from Levites being priests to only Aaronites being priests, and each of them brought with them their collection of their local liturgy, which then eventually got coalesced into larger collections, which then got put in, created into the Book of Psalms. If you take a look in the earlier, it's generally assumed that the first 2 to 3 books of the Psalms are the earliest ones, generally. Psalms are very difficult to date, but it's assumed that all of these ones attributed to these clans are virtually all in the first 3 books. So they're pretty early stuff, and the language too. The later Psalms tends to be in a later Hebrew than the earlier Psalms. Okay? Again, there are some exceptions, but it's with only a couple of exceptions, it's impossible to date the Psalms precisely. But it's now believed that, so we know that in these shrines and temples, accompanying the sacrifices were singing and musical instruments. That was part of the ritual. Nahum Sarna felt that the singing was probably done not during the morning sacrifice of the animals, but in the afternoon sacrifice of the meal offering and the incense. Why? Because it seems that's what was done in the Second Temple period. We have definite evidence that the singing and praying was done in the afternoon, and so that probably reflects the earlier practice that in the morning you do the animals, and in the afternoon you do the singing and praying and the meal and the incense offerings.
Also, the cows and the goats, they would be like mooing and bleating. It wasn't
You may absolutely be right. There is a very practical element to this.
Aesthetics.
Okay, so this is the picture of the public worship, right? Animal sacrifices in buildings or outdoor shrines with singing, with musical instruments. The animals consisted of, what we would call kosher domestic animals, birds of certain kinds. There were meal offerings and there was incense offerings, okay? That's what the public worship looked like. But it was by no means silent.
And is that assumed to be every day?
Yes, absolutely every day. And on extra ones on
the
everything.
incense went together, they thought?
Yeah, in the
I
afternoon.
thought the incense went with the animal sacrifice because of the smells and all that.
Yeah, that's true, but there's evidence that it was mostly done in the afternoon. Okay, so what else do we know about religion? Well, we know there were seers and prophets. Now, other groups in the ancient Near East had seers and prophets, but the institution of prophecy seems to be extraordinarily well developed in ancient Israel, much more so than in other contexts. And there are different terms. There's the choseh, which comes from the root for a vision. There's the roeh, which is meaning literally to see. And there's Ish HaElohim, a man of God. And the most common term, a navi, a prophet. All of these terms are used, but within the text itself, it seems that the term choseh was an earlier term, because in that story about Samuel, it says he was called he was a choseh. That's what we used to call navis in earlier times. All right? So there ample evidence for all kinds of things. It seems that many of these seers were priests at local shrines. There was an intimate connection between the shrines and seers and prophets. And we know even the later prophets, some of them were of priestly descent. Jeremiah was of priestly descent. Ezekiel was of priestly descent. Aaronite, by the way. And we know that they were priests were often attached to shrines and temples. And Isaiah has his big prophecy in the temple. I mean, there's an intimate connection between these. Yeah.
What is the difference between a seer and a prophet?
Well, technically there isn't, but it seems that in the earlier period, well, it depends. Seers tended to be people who you went and you told the future, right? What's going to happen. The Navi is more complicated and tends to be also ones who is going to give moral messages and things like that. In other words, both elements you find in there.
In the Navi classic, like literary Navi, what I was taught was that they're really not.
Yeah, exactly.
They're really giving warning.
Yeah, they're
communicating a warning about the future if you don't follow.
But to a certain extent, but they have their roots in this earlier thing. We also know that in addition to having these seers and prophets associated with shrines, there were wandering bands of these seers. They were like a guild almost. They were a group of people. One of whom was kind of the seer and the other were the disciples, and then out of the disciples would come another one. We know, and they referred, the head of the band was referred to as the father, right? And we know that they used music and dance to put themselves into an ecstatic state to give prophecies of the future. But that kind of thing does decline and evolves into this higher kind of what we call the later prophets, the literary prophets like Amos and Hosea and Jeremiah. I mean, the institution evolves. But originally it's basically people, you want to know what's going to happen. Is the crop going to be good? You go find a seer. And usually you're going to find them at their local shrine. By the way, women could be seers as well. There were women. We have evidence of women prophets. We have actually have a couple of names of such women. Right?
And wasn't Saul also among the prophets?
Well, Saul goes into this ecstatic state, and that's why that's weird, okay? Because here's a guy who's going to become a king, and he goes into this ecstatic state, and then comes a proverb, is Saul also among the prophets? Is he also a prophet, you know? Yeah. That was weird, okay? That was an unusual kind of thing that happened, all right? Normal people don't join these groups. So that's... And we know, for example, that during the times of the kings had their own private prophets. That was another thing. There were royal prophets who they would then say, okay, I'm going to go out to battle. What's going to happen? And there's stories about that. Isaiah was probably a royal prophet.
Elisha? Is he a royal prophet?
No. Elijah and Elisha were independents. Okay, but we have ones that are very specifically royal prophets who are usually yes men, you know. Should we go out? Yes, God's with you, basically. So you have, again, prophets. I mean, David had his prophet, Nathan, right? Who was a critical prophet, by the way. One of the functions of a good royal prophet would be to sometimes challenge the king. So you have these different kinds of prophets. Again, shrine prophets, wandering independents, like Elijah and Elisha were wandering independents. And then you have royal prophets. And then, again, it evolves into these independent prophets who are not connected to shrines, who are not connected to a royal court, who are, you might call, social critics, like Jeremiah, like Hosea, like Amos. And by the way, those are the people also who are a part of this changeover to the biblical religions. Okay? All right, any questions so far? All right. One other important part of and I'm putting this as part of public ritual because this is all very public. An important element of public worship and ritual is specific to Judea for various reasons. Number one, we don't have the documentation from the north. The northern kingdom, and also because the northern kingdom did not have a unified dynasty throughout its history. It had a number of dynasties. It was, relatively speaking, you know, the royalty, the whole institution of kingship in the north was relatively unstable. But in the
Coup after coup.
you have a number of coups. I mean, the longest any dynasty reigns is, I think, 3 or 4 generations. The dynasty of Omri, of which Ahab is one of them. But what you have in the south is this continuous dynasty, the descendants of King David, unbroken, from David through the destruction of the first temple. Okay? Now, as a result, we know that there was what we call the Judean royal cult. All right? And what does this mean? And here I've given you the main features. Number 1, the king is chosen by God, whom God has a special relationship as described by the metaphor of sonship. The king is described as the son of God. All right? And you see this in Psalm 89, in Psalm 2, in Samuel chapter 7. It's a kind of adoption. All right? Number 2, there is a covenant of God with the Davidic dynasty that is eternal. It's not, and even doesn't depend on the behavior of the king. It says very clearly in Samuel chapter 7, God tells David, yes, I will punish your descendants if they do wrong, but I will never reject you again, your house again, like I rejected Saul. The Davidic covenant is unconditional, as opposed to the covenant of Sinai, which is conditional, right? The old covenant, who were the mediators between God and the people? Well, the priests and the prophets. But in the Davidic royal cult, the king becomes the mediator. Again, the royal cult is practiced in Judea, in Jerusalem. I'm sure not everybody accepted it, but this was the royal ideology. Okay? And the main...
Interesting, Rabbi, you don't give us in subsection 2 of 4, you don't give us a citation.
Oh, well, the citation...
This is one of the
the citation of number 2 is 2 Samuel chapter 7, when God is talking to David. The citation in 4 is the building, turning of Jerusalem into a royal center, not connected to any tribes, and the building of the temple, right? In other words, what happens is that the Judean royal cult says that we don't have local clan structures anymore. We have a centralized political authority, and we have a centralized religious authority. Even if Solomon's temple begins as a royal chapel, it becomes the preeminent temple. And ultimately, it becomes the only temple, right? So there's this centralization that goes on even before the Deuteronomic Revolution. But the Davidic covenant and this idea of one central religious place, comes out of the Judean royal cult and has an influence on the later revolution. And think about it.
What's the citation you had there for that?
2 Samuel 7.
Is the centralization.
Yeah, the building of, when David captures Jerusalem and he builds everything there, and Solomon completely just knocks down the old clan structures for administration. I mean, there's a real political centralization going on under the Judean kings, right? Now, this notion of the Davidic dynasty eternal, of course, gets ultimately translated into the idea of the Messiah, right?
Who's leading that? Is it like the court?
The kings are doing this.
The king is doing it himself.
Yeah, of course, and it's being accepted by the Judeans.
It's like a la Russia.
Well, it's the Judeans. I mean, this was their political / religious ideology. All right. Now, the king in the royal theology is seen as the protector of the poor and the weak, and mediating the wishes of God upon his people as a representative of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And by the way, this comes out in some psalms that are referred to as the royal psalms. The king himself, in many aspects, is seen as given almost supernatural powers, even when compared to gods of other nations. The king was also seen as the protector from chaos and misfortune. So when you look at some of these royal psalms, let's take a look. Look at Psalm 89. This is an example of the royal ideology is in Psalm 89. Also Psalm 2, by the way, but this is on page 1523.
Which one is it, 89?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, it's not one of the psalms attributed to David. It's attributed to one of the Levite. It's Ethan the Ezrahite. Notice verse 4. It starts with a typical kind of beginning a series of praises of God as an introduction, and then in verse 4 it says, "I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to my servant Avdi." That's the same thing that Moses is called, right? "My servant David, I will establish your offspring forever. I will confirm your throne for all generations." All right? And then it goes on and talking about God as being sort of, the creator and crushing and so on and so forth. But the fact is that if you take a look further on in verse 20, it then says, "When you spoke to your faithful ones in a vision and said, I have conferred power on a warrior. I've exalted one chosen out of my people. I have found David, my servant, anointed him with my sacred oil. My hand shall..." It just goes on and on and on, okay? So this is an example of the royal theology.
Isn't that like an influence like from Egypt, from other...
Well, that's an interesting point because the role of the king in Mesopotamia is very different than the role of the pharaoh. In Mesopotamia, they're seen as God's agents of God, the God's power on earth. You're right. In Egypt, the pharaoh is God. Now, the Israelite king is never God, but he's a lot more than just God's agent. The Davidic king is God's son, in a sense, right?
That's what the Christian calls.
Yeah, that's part of why Jesus' genealogy traces him back to King David. Okay, I'm saying this gets translated long before Christianity into the idea of the Davidic Messiah. Okay, yeah.
How did 23 get so popular?
What do you mean 23?
Psalm 23.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know why Psalm 23 became so popular. All right, so that's the Judean royal cult. So let's pass on to the last part of this, which is what was going on in the home. Well, first of all, what went on in the home was primarily done by women, we're pretty sure. First of all, we have evidence both in the Bible itself and from archaeology that what went on in the home, one of the most important things was prayers for fertility. Okay? You have these biblical texts, Hannah's prayer, all a variety of things about...
She goes to the shrine.
Yeah, exactly, but she's the one who prays. In other words, if you look through all these references, you will see reference, the first ones, you will see reference to fertility. And here's again our famous thing from Kuntilat Ajud. This was an amulet. This is a fertility amulet. That was its original function. The strange figure here is this, the Egyptian god Bes, that was actually found at Tel Dan during the Israelite time. So what happened is that Israelite in their home had these fertility fetishes. That doesn't mean they were worshiping them as gods, but they were like amulets. And one of the things they have found tons of are these figures of women with large breasts. These are all fertility fetishes. They are not, originally they thought they were goddesses, but they're not goddesses. They're fetishes. There's a significant difference between the two. Yes, a figure of a goddess in your home you worship. These are like amulets that you keep around, and because the large breasts represent, of course, lactation and therefore fertility, and not only that, a safe infancy. Since so many infants died in early years, you want them to live, and this is a kind of amulet to help produce, well, to keep the demons away probably, but also to, in effect, the forces of fertility and health in the home.
So they had to give them power. or they wouldn't have had them.
Yeah.
They may not have worshipped them, but they attributed power to them, or why would they have?
Because they believed in magic.
Because that's
Like
what a
the
fetish.
trophy
Yeah.
that Rachel's
amulet.
Yeah, the trophim that Rachel, I mean, that's an example of it, stealing the household. Normally they're called household gods, but they're probably fetish figures.
What's the definition of fetish?
I think, Rabbi, what you have is a bunch of people who think that you're parsing this because you're a monatheist.
No, I'm not parsing it. I'm
and you
quoting.
want people to
I am
monatheism.
quoting from scholarly literature on this. I'll give you an example. Have any of you ever seen or have, you know, the Zuni tribes in the Southwest? Have you heard of the Zuni?
Yes, and
They're
the
one of the.
fetishes.
They have hunting fetishes, and we have a couple at home. Very often, they're a figure of the animal they wish to hunt with an arrowhead tied onto their back. So they're not worshiping the animal. They're saying, this amulet will help me hunt down this animal.
So it's like a charm.
It's a charm, yes. Call it a charm if you want. All right? A charm.
There you go, Irma.
No, but I mean, an amulet is something you usually wear. A fetish figure is something you usually keep. Like, the Zunis don't wear these things. They keep them in their homes, or maybe they take them with them originally on the hunt. I don't know. But the point is, that's the difference. If you had a shrine in your home to a god or a goddess, you would have a statue and you'd worship it and you'd do little sacrifices. The Romans did that, by the way. The Romans had household gods. We don't really have evidence, and I'm going to put a big but here at one point, that the Israelite home had household gods. We do know that they had fetishes, mostly for fertility. Okay?
When you say they weren't gods, you're saying based on the fact that there's no shrine structure.
Yeah, I'm going to show you one possible thing where that may not be the case, but generally speaking, there aren't little shrines. The other thing we know that was part of this whole area was what happens when the baby's born. There are rituals. And we have evidence, by the way, and this kind of stuff lasted for thousands of years because you find them in the Middle East. Anthropologists describe them, 100 years ago or less than 100 years ago. There was a ritual of washing the newborn baby, right? The cutting of the cord, the tying of a thread, a protective thread, and rubbing the baby with salt, which was done by Arab and Jewish women in the Middle East, up until modern times.
That red tie is still going.
Yeah, exactly. That tends to be from Europe, but yes, tying some kind of protective color thread on the baby. But we know from the book of Ezekiel, we have Ezekiel refers to these birth rituals of rubbing the baby in salt, washing the baby first of all, and then rubbing them with salt again, this is meant to protect the baby.
It does protect the baby.
Yeah.
It can be protective, right?
No, it's hygienic. That's
Okay. I mean, okay.
When you have a sore throat.
Yeah.
How does the salt do that?
it
It
sterilizes.
Sterilizes.
Tetany used to be a terrible problem with newborn babies.
So so we know it actually.
The cord is dead tissue.
Yeah.
It gets infected. You put salt on it, it doesn't get infected.
Right. So we know
Salt
that.
dehydrates things, and that's how.
It kills in a variety of ways.
Right,
Let's
but the point is that this was a very ancient ritual that we put as part of home. Again, there are medical benefits, but you have to see this within the context of the home religious ritual. Okay. The other thing we know is that lamps were important. Lamps were not just for light, but were also emblems of God's presence. This is an Israelite 7-branch lamp from around 800 BCE. In other words, it's reflective of the menorah in the temple, which was 7 branches. Right? Why 7? There's all kinds of arguments about that. But the point is, we have texts from Proverbs and Job and 2 Kings that lamps were not only for light purposes, but had a kind of religious function as well in the home.
7 days a week.
Yes, that's true. Or the Sabbath. I mean, it's hard to say. The other thing is naming rituals. When you look at who names children in the Bible, 62% of the time it's by women. So the naming of the child after its birth was a form of religious ritual. Naomi names Ruth's baby, right? Hannah names Samuel. Sometimes they're named by both parents. Seth is named by both Adam and Eve. Gershom is named both by Moses and Zipporah. Benjamin is named both by Rachel and Jacob. She wants to call him something else because she's dying, but the point is, most of the time, it's women who give the names. In other words, when you look at the stories of the birth of the children of Leah, the whole Jacob, Rachel, Leah thing, except for the end, when Rachel wants to name Benjamin this terrible name because she's dying and Jacob overrules her, all the other names of the children are by the Rachel and Leah. Jacob never names his sons. Okay? It's the wives that do it. So that's an important thing. The other thing is that circumcision may have been done by women mostly. In the story of Gershom, Zipporah is the one who circumcises him. It may not have been exclusively women, but certainly women were doing it.
Well,
right?
Abraham does it for Isaac.
Well, yeah, Abraham does it for Isaac, right. The other thing, of course, we know is that they all believed in demons. This is something that the biblical authors have specifically tried to cut out, but there's definitely evidence from Leviticus and Isaiah that there were demons and that people were doing rituals to propitiate the demons. Now, part of the revolutions that occurred both with the priestly tradition and with the Deuteronomic is to get rid of all this stuff. And if you look in the law codes of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, more so in Leviticus even, there are strong condemnation of magical practices. And yet we know it was happening. And why? Because everybody believed in demons, but for the priestly tradition and for the Deuteronomic tradition, that was getting too close to polytheism for them. So there was really an attempt, which failed, by the way, to get rid of the idea of demons. And according to Mary Douglas, if you look at a number of the rituals in Leviticus, they originally were anti-demonological rituals, but the priestly tradition transformed their meaning into religious rituals about holiness.
For example?
Well, a lot of the stuff to do with the impurity things probably were anti-demonological originally. Yeah.
Even today, a Kohanim must save his firstborn.
Yes. Well, yeah, that's true. The priestly descent is still the Pidyon Haben, right? Right. But the fact is that the reformers failed in their attempts to eliminate demons from Israelite religion and later Judaism. I mean, up until the modern period, with the exception of a very tiny group of philosophers, all Jews, Christians, and Muslims have believed in the existence of demons, and the way you get rid of them is through magic. And use of amulets, of course, continues down and even gets bigger, right? I mean, the only person that I know, the only Jewish person in the ancient world who didn't believe in demons was Philo. And in the Middle Ages, it was Maimonides, Ibn Ezra, and other, Sa'ad Gaon, and they were an incredibly elite group of people, and even the Kabbalists believed in demons, and, everybody believed in demons because it was actually a very good way to explain suffering. In other words, why am I suffering? Why am I sick? Well, a demon got you. Demons are like viruses. That's the best way to describe them. They are the ancient equivalent of viruses. So if something bad is happening to you, you have been infected by a demon, and you have magic can cure you or get rid of it. The reformers, when they got rid of the demons and got rid of the magic, all of a sudden, then you've got the problem of theodicy. If there are no demons and I'm suffering, then it must only come from God. And if it's coming from God, why is God doing this to me? And then comes the whole history of answering that question. It's the strict monotheists who create the problem of evil. No, really, they do. Because your average Israelite, he knows under some circumstances God may be punishing him for his sins, or the nation, right? But he knows that your average day-to-day things that happen, number one, I believe they believed in chance, by the way. There's an indication that they believe that things just happen, you know? You fall down and knock your head. That just happens, right? But they believed in demons. And demons are the way to explain suffering, your day-to-day suffering. Also, by the way...
without needing to resort to life after death.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. The other thing, of course, is that we tend to forget is that before the development of anesthetics in the 19th century, people put up with a lot more pain than we do. Pain was seen as a normal part of life. Not that people liked it, but, you know, it was part of normal physical existence. It's when you develop anesthetics that pain becomes abnormal. We consider pain to be abnormal. I mean, I'm talking about, I know that it's biologically necessary to warn us of certain things happening, but when you have a way to get rid of pain, you use it, you know, unless you say it's a punishment from God and, you know, I'm not going to avail myself of it. But pain is abnormal, whereas before it was a normal part of human existence. Okay. The one thing that the issue of the house gods. Okay. Here we have some weird stuff that's been found. These are house shrines. This one is from Tirza from the 10th century. This is definitely Israelite. Now, according to people I've talked to, nobody knows what to make of these things. This is all fairly recent, by the way. One of the problems, again, is that these house shrines were not found in an archaeological site. They were bought on a market. There's a guy who has like a whole bunch of them. And again, there's a big discussion amongst scholars. Well, this one actually was found. This one was found in an archaeological dig. But most of them have not been. And they're not always 100% sure they're Israelite. This one is definitely Israelite. Because it was found in an archaeological dig in an Israelite lair. This one is from the 9th and 10th century, maybe Israelite, may not be Israelite. This was not found in a dig.
How do you know for sure that it's a shrine?
Because that's what it is. It's a little shrine. It's got pillars. It's exactly like a little temple.
But it's like kind of a...
It's a little house. No, it's about this big. Right. It's a house. There may have been figures inside. This one is from the 10th century BCE. This one is also from the 10th century BCE. And hang on, this one you see the chairs in there. There are little thrones inside. Notice there's two of them. This
so
is.
Would that mean so for that you're going to say indicated worship going on?
Maybe, and the two
little
little chairs may represent the idea of God having a consort. The fact is that yes, nobody knows yet 100% to make of them. On the one hand, they could indicate that notice they're all pretty early. That in the earlier period, Israelites had little shrines to God in their homes, and some of these shrines may have had a shrine not just to God, but to God's wife. They disappear, by the way, later on. I mean, you look at the dates of all of them, that they've been able to date them. But just like the temple had two pillars in front, it's got two pillars, you know. I mean, it's a little house shrine. Again, how wide...
10 centuries BC.
Yeah. It's from Moab, though, so it may not be Israelite. But some of these are not sure they actually are Israelite. But the first one was definitely found in an Israelite level. And it's pretty early. It's 10th century BCE, okay? You don't see them from the later period, which suggests this stuff, whatever it was, died out or was deemed to be wrong. But at an early period, some people were worshiping God or maybe God and his wife inside their homes. In other words, they did have family gods. And there is some textual evidence. The Trophim of Rachel may be household gods. They may be fertility. It's very hard to tell. Okay? So this is an area that we still don't know. They haven't really decided what they are. But evidently some Israelites had shrines in their homes. Okay, last thing, death and burial. It was normal to say that the Israelites didn't believe in an afterlife. That they believed that they were part of a matrix of their family. This is the way I used to say it. They were a part of a matrix of their family, their clan, their tribe, and they lived on through their descendants. That's not true. I no longer hold that. The Israelites did believe in some kind of afterlife. It's not the kind of afterlife that later Jews would believe in. Okay? How do we know this? Well, by the way, this figure is of a mourning woman, so again, some kind of figurine, possibly, to do with a death ritual. We know from the Bible, by the way, that they actually were professional women mourners who were hired to mourn and scream at funerals. Okay? Greeks did, Romans did this as well. The point is that when they find burial sites of ancient Israel, you find things left in the grave. Food, amulets, dishes. In other words, things for the dead person after their death. So, and in some of the graves, and this really shocked me when I found out about it, they found these little tubes from the surface to the tomb where they would pour water and wine down to feed the dead.
Where is it?
In Israel, ancient Israelite tombs. I don't have a specific example of it. I tried to find one, a picture of it. I couldn't. And they know that wine was poured down because they found the residue of wine in the tube. Okay? So, the assumption previously is that when you died, all that was left of you was a shade that went to a place called Sheol, which is the underworld in the ground. And nothing happened there, essentially. Right? We now know that Sheol was only for people who died a bad death or died unburied. In other words, Sheol is the place, if you were a terrible person, if you were not properly buried in your family tomb, that's where you went. It's almost not quite hell, but it's not a nice place. Okay? It's not a nice place. Your shade ends up being unfed, uncared for.
Say shade.
The residue of your
Not
after.
demon like Hebrew shade.
No.
Would you say your shadow?
Shadow or your, I don't want to use the word soul because that denotes later on, whatever is left of you after your life goes there. Now, and that's why one of the worst things that can happen to a person in biblical text is to not get a proper burial. And the burials are usually in family tombs. Now, there's some evidence that in the earliest periods, they actually buried the people underneath the floors of their homes. Okay? Because the homes would be lived in for generation after generation, and you would be literally living with your ancestors. Very likely some people were buried in simple graves, but one of the things we have found a lot of are burial caves. Right? Here's one from Tel Khalif, which is from the 9th century BCE. It's a tell that is northwest of Beersheba, I believe. This is the entrance to it. And here's the inside, and you see there are benches, sort of places around for the bodies. What happened in a later period was they would bring the body in and put them until it desiccated, and then they would take the bones and put it in a special place. And in the Second Temple period, they would then put the bones in a box. Okay? And the boxes would be put around the tomb. But the point is, these burial caves, the burial caves they found are probably for the more wealthy people, and they actually have found the burial caves of the Judean kings in what we call the city of David. There's definitely some archaeologists claim one of them is actually King David's tomb. But the point is, amongst the wealthy, you built these burial caves, sometimes the fairly elaborate ones, and the families would go to the family graves on particular occasions to feed the ancestors and have a ceremonial meal. There's a lot of arguments about this in the scholarly literature. But evidently, they believed that if you were properly buried, you lived on with your family, and they would come to you and take care of you, and they would ask you to intervene with God. There was a kind of ladder, a messenger ladder, that the dead would talk to the celestial beings who would then talk to God. Right?
Where is that evidence? I mean,
there's a lot of stuff in the Bible about this stuff, and it's also
archaeological
archaeological stuff.
I'm waiting until point. I don't know if that's appropriate to say something, but I mean, this is either very new. This is both very new.
Yes, it's fairly new. It's fairly new. Yes,
and
it's
radically overturning.
Yes, it is.
Decades.
Yes, it is completely. It's completely overtaking what was known before, and there's still a lot of disagreement about the details. But the fact is that the Israelites believed in an afterlife. It was not like the later afterlife. It was more of a physical afterlife.
But how do what I'm struggling, because if you have decades of scholars teaching the opposite, including your mentor Neil Gilman, in what is still considered, as far as I know, the signature work, The Death of Death, on this issue.
Yeah, well,
and it's only 20 years ago when he wrote it, so it's. I mean, what happened?
What happened?
Found in the last
well, first of all,
archaeology.
It's pretty evident from archaeology that the Israelites believed that they came to their family graves and kept feeding the dead. I mean, it's very obvious from archaeology that, why did they put that silver amulet in the grave with the Birkat Kohanim? To keep the guy safe, right? And that led to a complete reconsideration of biblical sources. And so when you read John Levinson's book on death and resurrection, he's got a whole chapter on this, about the fact is that Sheol was not for everybody. Sheol was for the people who were nasty or died badly or died unburied. In other words, for some, you did something bad in your life, you ended up there.
Does Gilman agree with Levinson now?
I don't know.
In conversational Hebrew, Sheol is not a good place.
No, it's never a good place, but the point is, it wasn't for everybody. In other words, Levinson makes a very strong argument that, it's not, people don't go, not everybody goes there. If you've been a terrible person, yeah, that's where you go, but otherwise, if you're buried properly and you're honored properly, you stay with your family in a post-death existence that isn't so bad.
Why do you keep saying Sheol isn't like hell?
It's not burning. There's no burning fire there. It's basically, it's like the Greek Hades. Nothing happens down there. Okay?
They're going to the freezer.
Now, Levinson, what's the name of the book?
Well, it's on death and called The Restoration of Israel. Anyway, it's a very big area of controversy. There's a lot of stuff that's been written on in the last 10 years, and there's no universal disagreement on it. But the general outline is the Israelites did have a form of the afterlife. It's not what the afterlife was later on. That's the thing you have to understand. It wasn't kind of a spiritualized soul that goes up to heaven or so on. It was some kind of what we would call a quasi-physical existence on this earth.
Well, the fact, assuming it is a fact, that the unburied were subject to some liability here, right?
Yes.
The endangered indicates something about that you things can still happen to you after you're dead.
Well, yeah.
So you're dead, but you're still subject to this problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Handled correctly.
Yeah, exactly. And again, when you look at biblical texts about being unburied, it's considered to be one of the worst things that can happen to you.
But there must have been, I could understand the popular versus the official.
Well, again,
because there just are so few biblical texts that actually talk to this.
Yes.
And if it was significant in biblical religion, wouldn't you think there would be something?
So I asked Ben Summer about this, and he said because they just didn't want to talk about it. In other words, because first of all, you find certain things in the later Deuteronomic stuff attacking mourning rituals, okay, attacking the idea. There's evidently of feeding the dead, okay? There is some material on that.
You shouldn't conjure the dead. That's pretty direct.
Yeah, exactly. But it was so ingrained. The belief is that they just didn't know. They just didn't want to deal with it or talk about it because it was so problematic, and yet it was so universal.
So Rabbi Ben Summers is saying they didn't want to talk about
the biblical authors, the P and the D people, didn't want to talk about it.
What about modern scholars didn't want to talk about it?
No, modern scholars misinterpreted the D and the P material, but archaeology comes along and changes that. All right? If you give me 2 more minutes, we are now going to transition, and again, you can look up some of these texts that I've quoted. We're now going to transition to the biblical religions. And there are 6 characteristics of the biblical religions that shows you the change from everything we've been doing so far. First of all, number 1, there is a stricter monotheism. They really begin to narrow the definition of monotheism. And I'll show you at the beginning next week of where it ends up with a single biblical verse from 2nd Isaiah. Okay? Number 2, you have centralization of worship. There should be no other place where animal sacrifices of any kind are done except in Jerusalem. And that, of course, with a couple of minor exceptions, becomes the absolute rule in the Second Temple period. Number 3 is what's called myth versus history. This early material has what we would call great, the whole idea of God fighting chaos and all this stuff has great what we would call mythological things like the myths of the Babylonians and so on. Now, myth never completely disappears, but what becomes more important is sacred history. When you look at Deuteronomy is the least mythic of any of the books of the Torah and is concerned with history. So sacred history becomes important. So all the agricultural festivals become festivals around the Exodus, right? So that's number 3. Number 4, individualism. You really begin to see in the late First Temple period the move to the concern for the spiritual life of the individual. This becomes a major theme in early Second Temple literature that is in the Bible, like the book of Job, like Ecclesiastes, and a couple of other things, like many of the Psalms. The point is that the idea of the individual and their spiritual life begins to come to the fore. You begin to see religion as being a religion associated with a text, a sacred text. In the earlier period, most of the traditions were oral. They weren't sitting around studying biblical, what we would call sacred texts. It's only really with the Deuteronomic revolution that you have the idea that there is a sacred text that you must study. All right? And that becomes paramount in Second Temple period. And therefore, you get new forms of piety with the reduction prayer, which again is part of the old ritual, but prayer comes to the fore as being really important. I mean, it was always there, but now it becomes, almost as important as sacrifice, and study becomes a religious duty. That begins in the late First Temple period and, of course, becomes paramount. Not paramount, becomes incredibly important in the Second Temple period. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a Tanakh, right? The whole idea of the evolution of a Tanakh is the notion of study as a sacred act. And, of course, the rabbis elevate the study of Torah into the highest sacred act. Okay? So what we are going to see starting next week is how this evolved. I will say briefly that it predates the Deuteronomic revolution. It may go as far back as the late 9th century BCE with Elijah and Elisha. It definitely starts showing up in the
What's showing in Elijah?
This notion of the narrowing of monotheism. Okay, from the broader definition to the narrow one, what some people call Yud-He, Vav-He first ideology. I'll elaborate on this next week, but definitely when you look at the earliest prophets, the earliest literary prophets, Amos and Hosea, there's definitely this move away from a lot of the stuff we've just been talking about. They attack a lot of this stuff. And eventually this coalesces into the Deuteronomic movement, which really gets going when the northern kingdom is destroyed in the 8th century BCE and a ton of refugees come south. Now we know that a lot of the population from the northern kingdom fled south into Judea. All right? There's proof of that archaeologically. And they bring with them this ideology of what becomes the Deuteronomic revolution.
The northern people?
The northern, yes. The Deuteronomic thing starts with the northern prophets. Amos is a northern prophet. Okay? It starts with the north and it comes south. And of course it runs smack into the, into the royal cult. But the point is that most people believe it starts in the 8th century BC because we see it, Hezekiah tries to bring it about. It doesn't completely succeed when he dies, but later on, the revolution becomes complete under Josiah, who is one of the last kings of Judea. But there's definitely a northern influence in this. There's all kinds of proof for this, that this is so.
You've just given us a synopsis of next week's lecture.
Well, of what's going to come in the final 4 weeks.
Sorry.
We'll see you next week.
I know.
My hand.
You need it.